So we're going to talk about something called holy innovation, and I hope that this is something that will be helpful to you. And I want to just start off why this is important to me. This is the question that I think about all the time. Um, I remember when I was in seminary the first time around, I was in a pastoral counseling class, and I think a young student who I thought was a really smart student, and I really appreciated him. He said something in class, something to the effect of like, what does it take to be a good pastor? And I think he was sort of leading the question to think like, what are the main tools or main pieces of knowledge you need to be a good pastor? And the professor at the time just got silent for a moment and thought about it, and he said, I think it's a willingness to just be comfortable with being over your head all the time. And I don't know if that kind of resonates with some of you here today. Um, but it made a lot of sense to me in that a lot of what we do is in pastoring is just dealing with unforeseen events, crisis. What do you do when you're in crisis? And the problem with crisis is that you can't foresee it. You can't be prepared for it. And I realized, like, isn't that exactly what Paul was saying in our Christian walk, is that we walk by faith and not by sight. And so if we as a church are always walking in the unseen or the unforeseen, um, we're going to keep coming up against things that we've never seen before. So the word that I am so exhausted of hearing, but I use it all the time, is unprecedented, right? People say all the time that we are in an unprecedented era, with COVID and all this stuff. But this is just the world we live in. And so I kind of want to open today just for you to think about this as lay leaders and as pastors. What do you do when you're stuck in crisis? Because this is, in essence, like, I think this is one of the most important things for us to think about when we're in ministry. And as I continue to share, like, if you folks have questions, you feel free to put them in the chat. And then I am going to give a dedicated time at the end of this for questions and reflections. So I really welcome those because those are very valuable for all of us. Okay. So next, creative confidence. This is something I want to ask you, these questions, just to think about them. Maybe if you want to take notes on your own, this is something that you might want to think about in your own space. How confident are you in your creativity? So how confident are you in your creativity? So if I ask you, hey, can you make something new? Can you make something? How confident do you feel that you can do that? How confident are you in the creativity of your church's leadership? Okay, so now it's a little different, right? So why I'm talking about this as how I'm talking about this as pastors and lay leaders is, if a crisis came to you, how confident do you feel like you could come up with a solution? So that's one thing in yourself. But then also for some pastors, it's like, how confident do you feel about the leadership that you're a part of? How confident do you feel like that they could come up with something? And then the third thing to think about is, how confident are you in the creativity of your congregation as a whole? So I've seen this too, is that these three layers of the pastor, the lay leadership, and the congregation, sometimes we have a very creative pastor, but the pastor doesn't feel like the leadership's very creative, the congregation's not very creative. Sometimes you have like a very creative like leadership circle, but there's that talk at your diaconate or church council meetings, and it's like, I think that sounds great, but I just can't see like the congregation coming up with that solution, and we're stuck. I don't know how you feel where you are, depending on the size. And I'm really thankful for the makeup of our group here. We have a very diverse collection of congregations with different sizes, different backgrounds. And so all of you have to answer this in your own way. There's no one better thing, no one better context. We're all just unique, and I believe God's called you to that place. But I think this is a great question to ask. Whatever your context is, how creatively confident are you? If it's helpful, you don't have to tell me right now, but just for yourself, if you could go from 1 to 10, if you could rate, what do you feel is the creative confidence you have in yourself, in your leadership, in your congregation? Might be kind of interesting to just see. Okay. So during COVID, there was just a lot of talk about leadership because everyone was pivoting in a big way, as you can imagine. And what we were talking about was like, how can we be creative in times of crisis? And so I found this article from Forbes just about leadership responses to the pandemic. And so this is in a secular context, but they had talked about these kind of four types of crisis responses. So if you can see here, it's kind of split into these four quadrants, and in the bottom left there is the dangerous dunce, and that's basically someone who is not ready to deal with crisis and also does not do anything. These are very dangerous people because when crisis comes, they're not ready, and they also have no inclination to do anything, right? So then we go to the second tier here is that they are indeed ready, but they don't do anything. And this is what they call like the calculating opportunist. Well, actually, I should kind of clarify, sorry. It's not just not do anything, or they do something that is negative. They do something, but it's not a positive action. So these people are people who would be doing nothing or doing something that is negative, but they're not ready for the situation as well. And so, what happens with these folks, well, sorry, that they're ready for this, is that they just look at crisis as an opportunity to do something that's best for them. And I wish this doesn't happen in churches, but I have seen this, unfortunately. Number three is something I see very often is that congregations or organizations are not ready, but they are really willing to do the work. And so they do things, but they don't really have a plan. They're not really ready. They haven't really thought things through. So they're just kind of shooting from the hip. And these people are very caring. Now, again, this is a secular thing. I don't know if I'd use the word caring fool, but I think they're misguided. And so a lot of times their care does not really end up being impactful or effective. Now, the fourth one, according to this article, is about the true leader, is about how can we be ready when the time strikes, and how can we also do positive action? So this is kind of like an example of like that number four quadrant is when we are being creative, finding solutions, and we're also being positive. So I'm going to guess from the group here that you're here because you want to think about how can we be true leaders for our churches in a time that is really tumultuous all across the board, whatever your denomination, whatever your background. These are very tricky times to be engaged in the life of the church. And so that's what I want to address today. So if you look at this chart here, the church is definitely at a crossroads. If you're looking at this from 2019 to 2021, I know this is 2 years old, so I apologize, but you can see here there's definitely a trend just in these 2 years. How you can see like when people were attending beforehand and attending after. Well, actually, I don't want to say after. I'm always catching myself. I don't want to say after pandemic, but like post, like when the pandemic hit, right? Um, you can look at all these different demographics that were done by this Institute for Family Studies and some of the conclusions. I want to just look over that. Have you noticed like where are the biggest drops? Who was affected the most? Who's falling through the cracks? So just to summarize the state of the church, by September 2021, 98% of churches had returned to in-person worship services, right, according to Lifeway research. However, the average pastor saw 73% of their church members in person on Sunday mornings. So in other words, more than 1 in 4 pre-COVID churchgoers are still missing. So I don't know if you're thinking about your own churches, but like, yes, we all basically started up again and meeting again, but that's a pretty significant chunk of people that we don't see in person anymore. And for whatever reason, there are many reasons. We found in this research Adults who are 65 and older are much less likely to attend at least monthly now, 32% of them, than before the pandemic when it was 41%. So that's a significant, these are significant numbers for those 65 and older. But the largest age demographic drop happened among young adults. In 2019, 36% of 18 34-year-olds attended church at least once or twice a month. That has now fallen to just 26%. So these are significant numbers. In terms of ethnicity, the largest demographic drop has been most pronounced amongst Black churchgoers. Prior to the pandemic, Black Americans were by far the group most likely to attend religious services regularly, with 45% attending at least monthly. But today, it's 30%, similar to the current rates among white, which is 27%, and Hispanic Americans, 31%. So this is something that we need to uh, not be judgmental about, that we don't want to be panicky about, but like just to recognize like this is something that we need to turn our attention to. And I wish I could say that this is something that was a recent trend, but here's a very longitudinal study for the past 20 years, and it goes up to 2020. So this is a bit dated, but I hope this can show you a very interesting trend if you've just seen about Christianity in America. If you can see these trends of the practicing Christian, the non-practicing Christian, and the non-Christian. Now you can see here that those who identify as non-Christian from 2000 to 2020 has changed considerably. This 12%. And then from those who are practicing Christian from 45% to now 25%. Pretty significant. And then to see the non-practicing Christian, that they have actually also increased as well from 35 to 43. Now, I teach, as I was mentioning, an undergrad course in just introduction to Christianity. And all the students noticed what happened in 2012. I have my own theories. We had theories talking about this. And I think there's a lot of things that could be said about it. What is it about around 2010 to 2013 that made such a change? I think there's a lot of conclusions that we can draw, and I wonder if some of you would be interested. There's one of the big things I'm thinking of is obviously like the elections around that time. There was also, or maybe setting the conditions for the election, um, the economy, a lot of things of the state. But basically, what we do see here is a major shift in the way that people are seeing the place of the church in their lives. And I think that's the big takeaway that we want to do. And so we as a church need to think, okay, now that we are in these times, how do we pivot? What do we need to do? Because we can't keep doing church like we did 20 years ago. Now, friends, when I say like doing church in 2000, it doesn't seem that long ago, but it's 20 years ago. Isn't that crazy? I mean, I have students in my undergrad class who were born in like 2002, and they're like at the legal age now, and I was like, wow, I can't believe it. We're in changing time, and I think we need to address that when we're doing our ministry. So where do we go from here? Do we leave the past and create a new? I know some of you here today, maybe you're thinking that we need to abandon broken systems. When I look at that chart, that tells us everything that is wrong with the church that we've got to throw out the window, right? We've got to reject the outdated approaches we have. We have a lot of things in our churches that needs to go. Just yesterday, Paul and I were going through the Evergreen office, and we found so much junk that was just sitting there, dumped in the office. And yesterday was his day of liberation. We said, like, it's going to go. We threw out a bunch of stuff. Maybe you feel that way for your churches, right? And it's time to like create new programs that we've never done before, right? We need to do things that we've never seen before because everything we've done in the past is not working. I don't know if some of you feel like that, and maybe that's what you're hoping from today. Now, some of you here might be coming, the problem with America and that chart we saw is that we've lost our foundations, right? We need to actually study the past. We need to restore lost practices and traditions. So I don't know about you, but if you've seen some of these like quote cutting edge churches, a lot of times what they'll say is like, we want to get back to the early, first century church, and we want to get back to like the practices of the beginning of the church. We want to restore traditions that were lost. And so I found this very interesting trend amongst these new church plants is that they're trying to like study Paul again and study like how people did, evangelism and outreach in Acts, because they think that's where the key is. Some of us are thinking, how did we lose ourselves? That's why the church is in this crisis, because we're not doing what we used to do. So we need to return to simpler times. We got to return to like, when we were doing our best. Let's do those things again. Let's return. So I don't know how some of you feel today. Do some of you feel like you're in the camp of like, do we leave the past and create a new? Or do some of you feel like we need to return to the lost foundations? So I am a pastor and I always have fun asking this question. And it's this: what would Jesus do? Right? I mean, I think we have like armbands for it, we have t shirts, we have bumper stickers. What would Jesus do? So I think that's what Christians should do. I'm all for that kind of advice. But here's the problem: when we look at what would Jesus do, it's kind of complicated, because let's look at what Jesus says. John 12:24, it says, very truly I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. So for some of you, when you read this, you're like, yes, Jesus is justifying that we need to let stuff die, right? There is stuff in your churches, you're just really just ready to let's just tear it down. Let's just let it die, because we're not producing stuff, and we can't produce stuff because we're not letting it die. Jesus said it here in John 12:24, right? If we don't let things die, we're not going to produce things. And there are so many structures, attitudes, programs, behaviors that we just need to let die so that we can flourish new things. And Jesus said it, so it's got to be true, right? And actually, it is true. But Jesus also said, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. So in Matthew 23, we're seeing that Jesus is saying, like, you've got all these practices that you do today in the present, in this new time, but you forgot where you came from. You forgot the fundamentals of what God is about. And in fact, the answers are far back. If you really knew the Torah, you would have known that God is about justice, mercy, and faithfulness. But you keep zoning in on your new practices that have developed over all this time. You need to return. You did all these new things, but you neglected the former. And so that would be in the camp of saying, like, we need to return. And then Jesus got in discussion with the scholars in Matthew chapter 5, and this is another excerpt. And Jesus says this challenging word to us all, is that do not think that I've come to abolish the law of the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. And this is a very profound statement for me, something I think about all the time, because I think the scholars of the time were trying to corner Jesus. They were trying to ask him the same things, because if you think about the worship of the people of God at this time, they were also in crossroads. Their traditions were threatened by the Roman Empire with sociology. They were scattered as a diaspora, and they're wondering, what should we do, right? Is God going to bring a revolutionary to change everything and make it new? Or is the revolutionary going to like eradicate our enemies and bring us back to the old? And I don't want to get deep into this, but like, my concern with like a lot of the white nationalism efforts that are happening is that a lot of this is about let's get rid of the old, right? Like the Old Testament, right? I don't even really enjoy calling it the Old Testament, like the Hebrew Testament, because it's so valuable. You don't really know who Jesus is unless you know the Hebrew Testament. But you also need the Greek Testament because the Greek Testament and the New Testament, I should, or if you want to call it, is also about saying, what does it look like for God to incarnate the truth that has been revealed from the beginning? And so, how do you hold those together? And Jesus was trying to say, I'm not here to bring in one and to eradicate another. It's not old versus new, it's about old and new, because even the new is fulfilling that which was, quote, old. It's not about old and new, it's just about staying true to who we are in every season of life. And so we are called to both. We're called to hold in tension a journey that holds to our foundations in God, but also renews and transforms constantly. As Christ followers, we're continuing the cycle of birth, life, death, and resurrection, right? This ongoing process, I mean, for all the theology nerds out there, is called sanctification, right? It's an ongoing work of God, right? Developing, renewing, and restoring us into the full image of God. And so this is not just a trendy thing that we need to do now that we're in post pandemic. This is something that we should be doing in every season of the church. We are called to constant renewal, right? Second Corinthians chapter 3 talks about this, right? For to this day, the same veil remains when the old covenant is read. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is a spirit, and where the spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom. And we all, with unveiled faces, contemplate the Lord's glory and are being transformed into his image with ever increasing glory, which comes from the Lord who is a spirit. So, this is kind of like a phrase that I want us to draw attention to: Ecclesia Reformata Semper Reformanda. This might be something that you know about or you never heard about. This cheery gentleman that you see here is called Jodocus van Bodenstein. And he was a minister of the 1600s for the Reformed Church of the United Provinces and what we know as the Netherlands today. And he talked about the reformations that were going on in his time. And this was kind of a phrase that he coined. And basically, it means the church reformed, always reforming. Now, I know as Protestants here, as Baptists, we think the Reformation was about Luther. But if you know, if you even look at Catholic tradition, they've gone through their own reformations as well, right? There's Vatican I, there's Vatican II, and even before that, other kinds of movements. I believe firmly, if you study like church history and theology, that we're always asking hard questions, asking that kind of how do we get back to what we're about, but how do we address what God has called us to today? Yes, we are a church that has reformed in the past, but we always need to be reforming all the time. Think of all those reformations that you've seen, even in the American Baptist Church, in your own traditions. Christians are reformed, but always reforming, always, all the time, everywhere. There has never been one sole movement of God. It's always been this complex and diverse evolution of birth, life, and resurrection throughout time, backgrounds, and cultures. Every tradition has gone through a reformation and needs to do that in order to live. And this is what Jesus was talking about, is that if we don't go through this constant cycle of death and resurrection, we don't discover the life that God wants to give us. And so the question maybe for some of your churches here today is like, some of you are like, oh, maybe we're in a crisis moment, so we need a big restart, right? Some of you think you're doing really well and you're just like, okay, we're ready for like the next season of like just pressing on. And I want to say that those are both great, but like both of them need renewal and reforming all the time. Something I like to talk about is mid-course corrections. I don't know anything about sailing, but this is what I was told, is that when you're sailing, you need to constantly check in with your coordinates, because if you're even off by a couple of degrees and you continue on that course for a couple of hours, if you continue that way, you could be hundreds of miles off of your destination. And so every church, every time we need just during the course, just like checking in, keep readjusting, realigning, responding to the new situations. And so this constant act of always reforming is what I would call holy innovation. Semper reformanda is holy innovation in action. And so that's what we're going to kind of go through today. How can we get like some tools or some basic mindsets to help us think about how can we like continue to reform, like, and what that's what I would say is what innovation is all about. When people hear the word innovation, they think it's like, oh, that's for creative people, or that's for like cutting edge churches, whatever that means. But I believe innovation is a natural thing that all of you are already doing, maybe not aware of it. Um, but what I want to do is just give you a couple of mindsets to help you understand what does innovation look like. And innovation isn't just for like church plants. It's not for new starts. It's for all kinds of churches because we all need innovation. We all need reforming all the time. So let me tell you a bit about innovation. And then I'm going to open it up for like questions, reflections, clarification. So there's something that I've come across recently, just in my research outside of church, called design thinking and innovation. So there's this kind of concept of something called human-centered design thinking, where it is joining people together where they are in the world, attending very carefully to their ordinary lives, and improvising solutions to challenges that they face. Now that's a mouthful, but doesn't that sound great for the life of the church? Right? We are all about thinking of how we meet people where they are in the world as they are in their ordinary lives, and then helping them to respond to the challenges that they face, helping them to find solutions. And what I really appreciate about this kind of mindset is that it puts people at the center so that solutions always relate to people first. So this design thinking concept actually came a number of decades ago, and it came from like the manufacturing design world, where people were just trying to create products. Right now, it is a secular background, but I feel like they came across something that really fits well with our theology and the life of the church. If you want to learn more about this, there's a book that edited by someone called Debbie McMillan, and she has conversations with all these creative people to talk about what is design, what is design thinking. And I'm going to give you another book recommendation later and how it applies to the church. But basically, design thinking started with this product stuff, just asking these questions of like, if we create something, are we really addressing the needs of people? So are we making something that actually really serves the people? So if I create a chair, is it really a good chair that people would want to sit in that would really benefit their life? If I create a phone, is this a phone that is really for people? It's like, well, what happens often is that sometimes we'll build a phone and we have all these cool features in it and these cool gadgets and it can do all kinds of stuff. But we don't ask this, the question is like, does that actually help people? Does that actually do something for them? Now you're thinking, well, how does that relate to the church? I think I see all the time in churches, we create these beautiful buildings and these beautiful programs. And then we're like, are we really doing this for people? Or is it for like some abstract idea or a concept? Are we doing this for God? And so we kind of start with like our programs first and our solutions first. Just to give a little example, and I'm not saying this is any church here, but I have experienced in my own life is that something that people say all the time is we need a young adult ministry, right? So they just throw a bunch of cash at it and they hire this really fun young adult pastor, whatever that means, and they do all this song and dance. And whenever I see these churches, I'm like, did you actually talk to young adults about what they want? Because they're always mystified. Like, why is no one coming to our program? We're not getting young adults. We invested so much in it. Um, what is wrong with young adults? But the bigger question we should be asking is, did we talk to young adults? Are we aware of what they want, what they need? And that's what design thinking kind of covers. So, to talk about this approach in terms of ministry, I'd call Holy Innovation is a human-centered design thinking that encourages trying things out bravely as an act of openness to the Holy Spirit. Two, exploring our God-given context with curiosity and no judgment. Three, reflecting with self-awareness and openness about the movement of the Spirit. And four, commit to the above as an ongoing journey. And so this is an actual institution that teaches design thinking and innovation called IDEO. And I took that course and I really kind of reflected and meditated on it. And I thought about like, how could this relate to ministry? And these are the four things that we're going to walk through. I know I'm doing a lot of talking right now, but this is like the longest kind of lecture, if you will. But we're going to go through each of these steps and we're going to do exercises just to get us thinking about it. Okay. Just mindsets. We're not here to make like a huge solution in one day. I think it takes time. And I'm actually working with some of your churches right now in that process. And so some of you who are engaging with me like one-on-one, you might actually begin to see like, this is the process that I'm walking us all through. So if I can kind of clarify again, this is what holy innovation looks like, right? To find this mindset, to help you find a framework of how to approach challenges that you have. Because all of you have a very unique challenge, right? How do you do that reforming, that renewing, that resurrecting? And here are the things that I want you to kind of think of. Like, if I can really summarize it very succinctly in a couple of words, like several words, it's this is to be hopeful, right? To try things, right? To learn from those things that you tried, to reflect. What did we learn? And then from what you've experienced, how can you change and adjust to the new things that you've discovered? And then you just keep going. You do it over and over again. And this is just the life of the church. If there is no church engaged in this active reformation, this active holy innovation, then I get concerned because that means that you're no longer listening and aware of what's going on. You're just kind of going off of something. So maybe you had something really innovative and thrilling in the 70s, but if you're not continuing to ask these questions, how are you facing what the world is like in 2023, which is obviously very different? And so there's a book, if you're interested in kind of exploring this more from a ministry perspective, this book by Lorenzo Labria as a great kind of recommended reading to just check out how does he work about bringing innovation and design thinking into ministry. And again, you know, you can get these PDF slides from the Evergreen website under the leadership. It's at the bottom. All of these slides are there. Feeling a little overwhelmed. So again, just to go through, here's kind of a chart of what we're going to try and do today, very ambitiously. We're going to try and go through some kind of practice. And this is what we're going to go through. And I hope that these principles could actually be a part of your leadership. A lot of what I'd asked for people to be, people who are part of this retreat and the one that's coming next week, is that it would be the pastor and those involved in the leadership and helping like craft and execute the vision of your church. You know, the first thing that we want to do today is that we're going to observe. We're going to try and listen to what God's doing, right? Make sure that the things that God and the people are at the center of our attention, right? Not our abstract mission statements, not these abstract goals of like numbers and budget, but like the people. Let's like really observe what the people are doing. And then we're going to try and get some insights from it. We're going to like, okay, from what we've seen, what are some trends that we're seeing? Like where do we see that God is doing something special? And then we're going to just try to create something. We're going to work together as a team, and you all are all in teams today. So we're going to create ideas in community. We're going to work together to figure out not just some like abstract, oh gosh, I guess we should do something like this. We're trying to figure out a concrete solution, just some concrete action. to move a little further in those things that you learned from your insights. And then we're going to just try it. Just try it. This is the problem that I've seen in myself in a lot of churches. Like in the past, I was like, I want to cover all my bases first. I'm going to get it perfect. And once it's perfect, then we're going to launch it. But that's not real life. A lot of what we do in real life is just, let's just try something. And then we're like, oh, that was a mistake. Let's not do that again. Let's make it a little better. So next time around, we'll make something again. Um, and a lot of actually companies are now shifting to this kind of approach. I can talk about this more later, but this approach of thinking like agile management. But I think this is when I identify churches that are doing well, it's not about, man, have they really thought everything through? But it's like they're brave. They're brave churches that are willing to try stuff, and not just brave to try, but also brave to admit, like, hey, this is where we need to tweak. This is where we need to learn. This is where we need to adjust, and brave enough to try again. I think that is the sign of a really innovative church. They're just brave to try and brave enough to try it again. And that's which comes to the next part is that you learn. You learn from what you tried, ask questions about what worked and what didn't. And then, okay, what do we do next? And then we repeat. We try it again in light of new things we've learned. What did we learn this time around? What can we do next time? How can we take it forward? And it's this cycle. Now, it's not a cycle that goes in place. I like to think of it like a cycle forward. You could even call it stumbling forward. I think that's a great way of saying it too. It's like we don't have to like solve it all overnight. Just this time around, let's just do a little better. And let's be humble and even have a bit of humor about it. I've definitely done things in ministry where I'm like, wow, I'm so glad we did that because that taught me not to do that again, right? I have so many stories like that. And I'm not what you consider like this big mega church pastor or anything. I'm just talking about 25 years of just ministry. It's all just about trying to be humble enough to learn and to try and to learn again and to try again. So we're going to try and do this together ambitiously. I'll see how this works. I've never quite done teamwork like this in a Zoom format, but these are the times. I had to innovate. This whole day is like my own design thinking, like my trying to like, well, how are we going to try and do this, like impart some of this. So we're going to try and do this all together. So we're all in it together. I'm learning. Unfortunately, you are the first generation doing this kind of retreat and teaching. So I'm eager to learn too. And I welcome your feedback after all of this of how to do this. So here's something that I'm going to ask you to do. I asked you to do it in your email yesterday, but I'm going to give you some time to work together. I want you to figure out a project challenge for today. Okay. It's going to be a how might we statement that invites you to apply what you've learned in a real life situation or scenario. Okay. So, what's a project challenge? I'm going to give you a couple of examples and then I'm going to send you off into breakout rooms. Paul's going to send you out there. Here's some examples, right? Start off with a question, make it a question. So, here's an example. How might we provide a new ministry for an older generation? Another one, how might our church participate in empowering our community to adapt practices that are sustainable and helpful for our environment? Okay. Another one, how might we create a robust hybrid system of in-person and virtual worship service? I'm sure a lot of you are thinking about that, right? How might we inspire a thriving system of contribution and support for our church, right? What would be a project challenge for your church? Now, I want to be clear here is that you don't have to make this something that is really serious, that you feel like you have to have solved today. That's not the point. We're just going to try and use some of these mindsets and apply it to something. It could even be in an imaginary kind of uh, imaginary situation. And so, what we're going to do is we're going to choose a project challenge for your church and we're going to try and work on it. Okay. It can be real or not real. It can be, you could even take one of these 4 points, these examples. If you just want to adopt one of those, if you don't have one, that's fine. So I know some of you here are an individual and you don't have a church team here. So we're making a breakout room just for those individuals who've gathered. So the task for you folks is you're going to make up something like a project church, like an imaginary church. And how are you going to solve this problem? It would be ideal if you could have something common in mind that you just don't invent stuff. Because like I'm going to ask you to observe your church and like think about stuff. So if everything's completely imaginary, it might be hard. So when the individual group, you might want to focus in on one person's context and just use that person's context as the subject of what you're going to observe, if that makes sense. But we're going to just try and make a project challenge. I'm going to give you about 10 minutes to think about it. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We're going to go into our next session about observing, listening, and empathizing. This sounds sort of obvious, but it's actually quite difficult. I'd say this is probably the most challenging thing, and I'm going to walk you through what we're going to try and do today. So this is the map of the journey we're going to walk through with all of you, is we're going to try and have some time to observe our the context of what a challenge is about, so probably your church. And then we're going to listen, interview, and empathize. Now, the tricky thing is we don't have a lot of time today, and I thought rather than making this an unbearably long day, like going into the evening, I thought we'd just collapse the three, but I'm just going to give you some of the basics of what it's about. So again, as we're doing the exercises, don't feel overwhelmed that you have to do all of this perfectly. You're just trying to try it out. Just try out this mindset. And then think about maybe after this retreat, like how could you apply that in a more detailed, in-depth sort of way? And then we're going to go from there to form insights from what we've observed. And then we're going to try and make something. We're going to plan to do something real, like concrete. So one of the things that we want to discuss before I send you out into your groups is I want you to observe what your holy currencies are. If some of you know about this gentleman named Eric Law, he actually has done some work with Evergreen in the past with the Kaleidoscope Institute. And he does this really interesting thing where he identifies that every church has these holy currencies. And why I really like this idea is that he gets back to the original word currency. It actually is not about like money, like monetary value or monetary point. It's more about the word that comes from like the word flow. And so if you think of it that way, it's about this thing that is valuable that if it flows, that's when the real value happens, is like it flows into something else. And then a healthy ecosystem is when all the currencies are flowing into each other. And so he did this thing where he tried to identify the holy currencies that churches need to have flowing if they're working. So he identified these things like gracious leadership, relationship, truth, wellness, money, time, and place. And so I'm not going to go into great detail about these, but these are, I'm just going to go very quickly. Gracious leadership is basically what it sounds like is like, do you have leaders in place that really are gracious, imparting, have integrity, leaders of quality, right? The next is relationship, which is like, do you have meaningful connections in your church? Would that be a currency of your church? Meaningful and deep connections. The third would be truth. Now, this is a currency where, like, do you have the space, the currency in your church where you can speak the truth, like say honest things, maybe even hard things, but you feel like that there's not a lot of like deception or like maybe guardedness or that there is no space for truth. I don't know. Is that a currency in your church? The last one, the fourth one is wellness. Wellness is about, do you care about the well-being emotionally, mentally, physically of the congregation? Like, is that a currency, right? So, I mean, just earlier, I think Jamie, you had brought up, Pastor Jamie, about, does our church really care about the wellness of people, right? That would be a currency that you have in your church. The next one is money. Now, money is kind of more obvious. Like, do you have resources, right? Not just like hard cash, but like, do you have like the resources to help fund and support things that you do? Is that a currency of yours? And the last one is time and place. So It's about a building, yes, but not just a building. Is it like also about making a space for people? Do you have that as a currency? So is there something in your church where you have time to gather and not just the time together, but the space together, right? So is that a currency of your church? Now, just to go really quickly on this, you could have like a great building, for instance. So that means you have the time and place. That's a good currency, but you don't have gracious leadership. So it's like the flow gets blocked, if you can see what I mean. It's great that you have a building, but if you don't have the leadership, then the flow has been blocked, and that's something to identify. But the interesting thing is, like, you can also look at it as another way with this currency chart as they kind of flow into each other. If you have gracious leadership, that actually makes the space to develop the currency of relationship. And then if you have relationship, that's when you're willing to speak the truth to each other, right? Because, like, if I don't really love and care for my relationships, how can I speak truth into people's lives? And when I speak truth into people's lives, that's when my relationships are well and like my well being is addressed. That's when churches are healthy, right? Emotionally, relationally. And when churches are healthy, giving is not a difficult thing. They give out of the overflow of their life because they feel the health that is coming through their community. And when they're giving, they make the time, the place for the community. They'll invest in it, they'll make the time. And they will invest in making spaces physical and like relational. And when they have that healthy time and space, that's what really feeds and helps leadership to really grow and flourish. So you can kind of see if one of those currencies is healthy, like they begin to really flourish. But if you have a block in them, that's what happens. Does that make sense? So a lot of what I'm going to be asking you to do is to like take account of your churches and what is the currency that you have in them. All right. So here's some questions I want you to do in this coming breakout room. And this is going to be, don't worry if you don't remember this all, because I'm going to have it inside of your Google Slides. And I'll explain that at the end of this, right? I want you to observe things like, what are the values of your community? What does this community really care about? What are the gifts of your community? So this would be things like, what what do you really care about? So another way to ask it is like, hey, if our church disappeared yesterday, like what would be the thing I really miss about it? Because that church really cared about blah blah blah, right? Man, if there's something about our church, I think that we really, really are passionate about, it would be that, right? What are the gifts, the things that we are gifted at and good at in our church? Those are kind of questions you want to be asking in this observe time. So as you're doing this observation thing, here's some things to help guide you. I don't want you to just kind of like randomly just say stuff about your church. I want you to kind of like be disciplined in how you observe your church. Ask yourself, what are the things that people are engaged in, right? What are the things, the adaptations? When I mean adaptations, this is stuff like, when something's broken, you kind of make a fix for it, right? I know, like, I had this broken drawer, and so, like, the way I open it is, like, a special sort of way, so I adjust. I don't know if you have that kind of situation in your church. It's like something's not working in your church, so everyone in the church does a certain practice to get around it, right? That's something to kind of, observe, right? Uh, look for what people care about. What are the things that people really kind of get excited about, what they're really passionate about? What are the patterns in your church, right? What are the things that you see? Oh, this happens a lot in our church. Now, when you're doing these things, this is the most important thing about observing, okay? I can't stress this enough, is that you should just be curious, not judgmental. A lot of times when I walk this with like people in churches in my own church, we start to get really hard on ourselves. We start to say, oh man, when I look at my church, they don't do this, they don't do that. It's like, no, just get away from that. Just be like, oh, that's interesting. Just observe things about them. Don't make a judgment call on it, because when you make a judgment call on it, um, you're already like coloring your observations of the church, and you're not seeing them for who they really are. Sometimes when I observe a church, I keep thinking like, oh man, they have no ministry for young families. They have no ministry. And I keep harping on that. I keep observing that. But then I don't observe what they actually are doing. And maybe that's what I need to be paying attention to more. So look at the space and the environments, right? How is your space or your environment helping or frustrating your church? What are some of the unspoken messages that are there? And as you're really open, you might begin to discover some unexpected things, right? We just want to be observing at this point. Um, It's kind of like with the Bible. We get really bad Bible readings when I start observing the Bible with an agenda. You know what I mean? Like, "Hey, I'm looking for that verse that tells me about those people I really hate, you know? And you're gonna find a verse that sort of fits and you just cram into it. We don't want to be doing that. Like, we want to just be like reading it, just reading our congregation like a book and like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's interesting. Just asking those questions because this is going to help your project challenge. And according to your project challenge, now, for instance, if some of you had, um, how might we engage people in our congregation in volunteering? I think someone had said, you know, just observe what your people are like, right? Observe the people who are volunteering, observe people who are not volunteering. If you want to focus a bit, if you want to do like a young adult ministry, right? I don't think anyone said that, but just observe young adults, things that you've seen. Look for patterns. What do they care about, right? What are they engaged in? So you want to be asking open-ended questions in your group, right? Keep asking why until you get like the motivations behind it. That's what we really want to get at. Think about like what is behind the motivations. And then you want to be if you can, I mean, I don't think you can do this here today in your groups, but like if you could even ask the people that you're interviewing or asking, like, show me, show me what you're talking about. This is where, if we had the opportunity, you'd be in your churches and I could send you out and do interviews with them, right? Interview them, ask them like directly on a personal level, on a leadership level, on a congregational level. What are you talking about, right? Start very broad and then try and finish deep. Try and get to know people and see the bigger picture of who they are. Um, when I think about like ministry to the elderly, there are so many sweeping statements they say, but like, do you know like the big picture of who they are? Once you get to know that, then you can dig deeper into them. A lot of people make some like assumptions about youth, but do you really know who they are? And then can you go deeper? Right? If you identify things that are confusing to you or don't match up, like ask for clarifications, right? The last thing that's really important is to be very curious and not judgmental, as I said before, right? This is not a time for like as you're observing, like judge them, right? So an example is in the past is like, oh man, those people who are not going to church, like look at all the problems they have. I'm observing this and that. It's like, no, no, just observe who are they, right? Don't make any judgments yet. All right. It's hard. I think we do it much more naturally than we think. And I would argue that Christians are really good at it, unfortunately. So um, let's just be curious, not judgmental. Uh, this last part that is really important, and again, we don't have a ton of time, but I'm going to try and give you some empathy exercises. Think about it. Is find a way to get visceral understanding of your community and the people that they serve. Right. This is how we center ourselves on people, so we don't get caught up in abstract goals. So here's an example. I want to do a ministry to engage people in volunteering. So once I did my observations, I discovered we have a large number of single parents. Someone in the group needs to ask themselves, what's it like to be a single parent? Right? Start to get inside of that. Because if you start making programs and you're not actually inside the the bodies and the mindset and the emotion and the spirit of people that you're trying to reach out to, it doesn't make sense. A lot of churches create these programs and they haven't had this time to think like, well, do I really have empathy with them? Do I understand where they're coming from? And so that's really important. Um, I had mentioned that about the young adults thing before, about making ministry for the elderly. If we want to do intergenerational ministry, I think someone had mentioned, then you need to have empathy of what it's like to engage in a diverse generational group. What does that feel like for each person? And not just like generally, but like the people, the this particular general people, the particular people in your congregation in those different generations. What does it feel like for them? So here are some ways. This is going super fast. I think this will be harder. I think it would be easier in the future, but I'm giving this more as a resource right now. But here are three ways that you can kind of grow in empathy, like changing your perspective, limiting yourself. If some of you actually were thinking of project challenge, like how might I make my church more accessible um, to those who are differently abled? I might actually ask your leadership team, like, okay, well, all of you now cannot walk. So you're all going to try and do something where what's it like to go through your church if you were in a wheelchair and you're going around? You're going to do it physically. What does that feel like for you? What are some observations you discovered? Now, obviously, it's not everything, but how many leaders have done that, right? Um, how can you engage, right? Limiting yourself, right, from that ability. And then how could you engage in that? Actually try and do it yourself. We keep thinking like, well, that's the access is not a problem. It's like, well, you do it then, right? What do you think it feels like when you do it, right? For me, as a Korean Canadian, when I was growing up in churches, like, what do you think it's like when I go to a church where like I don't understand what anyone's saying because they're all speaking a language I'm not comfortable with, right? Have you done it yourself? Have you ever been in that situation where English was not the dominant language? Examples like that, empathy exercises. Okay. So I'm going to give you a group task. You're going to do three things here. You're going to take inventory of the currencies of your church as best you can, and then you're going to answer the observe questions and try and center them according to your challenge. And then at the end, the third one, if you have time, is you're going to choose one of the empathy exercises. So according to your project challenge, think about who are the people that are affected by your project challenge, and then try and just do a couple of like empathy thoughts of like, okay, well, if I'm trying to get engagement with them, like how can I get inside of the people? So if my pastor is asking me to volunteer more, how would it feel like if I was on the receiving end of that call? Some empathy things, just as a quick example. Okay, so we're going to start talking about insights. Now that you've collected all this stuff, what do I do with it? We're going to try and form insights from it. So ideally, when we're observing, this isn't really easy to do, or maybe it's not even fully possible to do. We want to be very neutral observers, right? I was talking about let's be curious, not judgmental. Now is the time that we start connecting the dots, we start making connections. So again, going to this map of our journey that we're doing together, we want to be observing. And that's what we did. We want to be listening, maybe interviewing people. If we had the time, we would have been doing that. As was mentioned earlier, more time is always appreciated. We would want time to like empathize with people, right? So we had that wonderful like just experience that was shared about just the difficulty of language. Um, in one way, one person felt like, oh, that's what it's like to not understand. But could you actually turn it around? Is that we only have two Spanish speaking people here. And when they are speaking to each other, how much they appreciated being able to communicate as minorities in this gathering today, right? What is the empathy exercise that's happening there? And so those are kind of things that we're doing when we're talking about empathy, right? Now, the next part we want to do is we want to talk about forming insights. So what we want to do with this is we want to collect all the information, the data, the observations that we have, and we want to be asking ourselves these questions. What was unexpected? What interesting stories did we discover, right? What did people care about the most? And that's kind of what I was trying to do with some of you, just as our follow-up with our last exercise. Maybe kind of identify what are some of the most frustrating struggles. It's very important that you don't project yourself too soon. Try your best to to listen to the people first on their own terms. Look for the links. Now, some personality types are better than this than others, but is there what I like to call, and I say this all the time, is there a golden thread? Is there something that is like a thread that's weaving through all of the things that we've been observing? Is there something that just links us all that if we just pull this thread, we'd begin to discover something that's going on? What are some of the themes? So if the theme that keeps coming up in your observations, like for instance, people keep saying, I'm busy, I'm busy, I'm busy, then you need to stop and pay attention to that. Like, what is an insight that addresses that common theme of busyness, right? And you want to dig deeper. Um, we talked about things like, for instance, elderly population, right? There are older churches. You might want to dig deeper into well, what is the social structure of our neighborhood that there is such a prevalence of those who are elderly, right? Um, Dig a bit deeper, or what are some of the access issues to the elderly? Like, you should start asking bigger questions as you observe something coming up. An example I might think of is my wife is from Michigan and Troy, and there's a very large number of people who identify as Chaldean, right, from the Middle East, and it's a very particular group, and a lot of refugees have come from there. So, you might want to dig deeper and say, well, what was it about this group of people who are refugees that wanted to come to this very particular place in Michigan? Dig deeper, find out more about it. It might take you somewhere. And so, as you start making these insights and just kind of collecting it, you want to be looking for the best, the ones that really stand out to you. This is actually the hardest part of any organization, doing these insights. In fact, they have experts who do this, for a living. It's really like a talent that you need to develop. But I feel like most pastors are doing this intuitively. But if we're more intentional about it and recognizing what's going on, it could really help us. Um, So here's things that we want to do when we're forming insights. We want it to be authentic, right? We want it to be an authentic portrayal of who you are. Um, Sometimes we observe stuff and then we jump to this thing where we say, so therefore we are like a seeker sensitive, like socially conscious, like theologically grounded church, right? And sometimes we want to jump to that conclusion before we've really observed. Like, is that really what your church is about from what you observed? Do they even know what it means to be theologically grounded, socially conscious, right? Seeker sensitive, whatever that means. Um, I feel like sometimes we make the jump too fast. Sometimes you might be, after your observations, you might be like, oh, actually, if I'm really honest about our church, we're a lot of people who don't really know what we affiliate with. We want to be good people, um, but we don't know how to be good people. You see, that is a lot closer to an observation, and we might actually short circuit what we really are if we start making an inauthentic judgment about ourselves, if that makes sense. The other thing is non-obvious. You want something that's non-obvious. It just goes beyond oh, we have a lot of old people, therefore we're an old church. That's not really. I think that's a very surface level observation. I think it should go deeper. You can't just say a whole generation of a certain particular age group is just like this because of their age. What is it about them? There's more to them. Find out what makes them unique. There's many different ways that the elderly gather, just like any other age group. Figure out what makes them unique. And then it wants to be revealing. Your insight should be something that gives you clarity to what you are and what you need to do. So if you're coming up with an insight that doesn't really shed more light on who you are, or doesn't give you shed light of what to do next, then maybe you need to dig a bit deeper in your observations. So you want to be thinking about something that is really clear. So this is hard. This is really something that you need to be very prayerful about, take time in discerning, weighing with other people. But I'm going to make you do it in 20 minutes. That's awful. It's just awful. but We're going to just try it. Just try attempt. So I want you to look at some of your insights that you had from before. And now you're going to go back to your Google slides and you're going to go to the next slides, which is about forming insights. You're going to go over the information of your observations or just talk about it. And then you're going to use the questions and criteria mentioned earlier to help you form some insight statements. Okay, so we're going to spend about 20 minutes to do this. And I encourage you to just like mull over stuff. If there's like more observations that you might want to add, just because like we didn't have enough time to observe, you can do that. But I want you to try and come up with at least one or two insights if you can. So here's what we're going to do in the group task. We're going to use like Post-it notes. You can use like virtual Post-it notes on your Google Slides, right? Observations and interpretations. You want to collect them all the things that you got from empathy and immersion, and just try and like place them. And then as you have those like little virtual Post-it notes or like copy and pasting, you're going to try and like copy and paste them into like categories or groups. Do you see something forming, right? Connect them together in meaningful ways. So maybe as you're looking at all the information, all that spewed out in the last presentation, you're like, oh, it looks like a lot of these are about this particular theme or this and that. And then what you're going to try and do as a group of your leadership team is begin to try and figure out something that is informative about your group, right? Keep trying to work on it. Now, what also might be helpful is that in your insight statement, you might actually even want to like open up another page in your browser and like even find like little images that help kind of solidify, like tell a story of what your insight is about. So for an example is like, you might really come away as like, hey, you know, our church is really concerned about the environment and racial justice. So you might want to actually find like visuals about like, what does it look like to be a community that's concerned about the environment? What does it look like to be concerned about, you know, racial justice, stuff like that. So I think sometimes having like these visual cues can really help you form a story. Now I know it sounds really artsy, but like that's really important if you want to be communicating this to your congregation, because you can have all the insights you want, but if you can't communicate it to your people and to yourself, then it doesn't really mean much. So I find sometimes people have some great ideas, but they don't know how to articulate it and create it. So a lot of what we're trying to do here is to form an insight and figure out a way that I can explain this insight. A lot of times, some churches are really good at observing, but that's all they do. And they can't seem to like connect the dots and form the insight. Some people love making the insight, but it's not really fueled by like a lot of good observations. So the observation is not in touch. The insight is not in touch with the church because they're not using observations. So I don't know what church you might be leaning towards, but this is very important. So I'm going to try and send you off. But before we do, I want to see if there were any questions about this that you might have. This one's a little trickier because it does require some kind of like a lot of the creative muscles, but this is really helpful for like people who are a little bit more like high level thinking, seeing the big picture. But I just want you to see if you can like arrange all your observation points and like try to make connections with them, if you will. Okay. So we're going to talk about insights to action. So this is where like some of you who have been itching, like I've been talking about all this like vague stuff, like observing, like think about it. It's very contemplative. It's very inner. Maybe the introverts are loving this stuff because like we're all like inside processing. But at some point, like what's this mean to the world, right? Like let's do something, right? That's what we're going to do today. So what we're going to put our insights to work now. Okay, so from our insights, I want you to think about what could we tangibly create to explore this further. Here's something I've noticed about churches. We have these great meetings, and sometimes we come with all these cool ideas, but we don't do anything. So like, how do you take those insights into work, action? That's what I want to talk about in this section. How can we make something that answers the question of our original project challenge. So I want you to call to mind what was your project challenge that you had at the beginning of the day. Okay, we're going to try and make something that answers some of those questions that we had in the project challenge. So I don't want you to worry about creating something that's perfect. Okay, we want to get away from this mindset of like, I've got to create this airtight, um, error-free solution, because it just doesn't happen. I think a lot of churches get hurt when they just try and wait for that magical moment when like we are going to launch this and there's going to be no problems. I think you should just launch it and say like, okay, we're going to just try a beta version of this, right? To take away from software talk. I actually have a presentation about the Agile Church that talks about this more. But a lot of organizations, they just start with something very lean and they just say like, okay, we're just going to try this as our first draft. And as we get out into the world, we're going to just observe, and then we're going to keep making cycles of improvements and tweaks and adjustments. So this is what it's about. We're going to create something, but it's just going to be an extended journey of many cycles. The key is you got to try something. The worst thing is when I meet people who just talk about all these ideas, but they haven't tried anything. And it's like, well, how will you know if it works or doesn't work if you just didn't try it and at least, go through a process? So we're going to talk about ideating, okay? Ideation is basically about coming up with lots of ideas to explore options for solving a problem, okay? So it's important for your playful mindset is very key to this. And at the end of the session, we're going to decide on one idea that you came up in your ideation session, and we're going to move forward with it. So I want you to be playful without judgment. Like, let's throw a bunch of ideas on the wall. Just see what sticks. Lots of ideas, okay? And creating as a team is always easier than doing it on your own. Okay, so we're going to do something here. I'm going to ask you to go to your chat box, and we are all going to help me out to do this one task. I'm going to give us 1 minute. Once I tell Siri to help me out here, we're doing a 1 minute, and I want you all to type in a flavor of an ice cream. I want you to invent a flavor of an ice cream. Okay, try your best to make an original ice cream flavor. We're going to see in this chat box how many flavors of ice cream we can create in this moment. Okay, so hang on a second. Hey Siri, set timer for 1 minute.
1 minute, counting down.
Okay, go. Let's all write it right now. Write in. Make up a flavor of an ice cream. You already have 5. Bacon. Awesome. Bacon and maple syrup. Sweet potato orange. Oh, some people have been thinking about this. Coffee fudge, cookie swirl, sausage. Oh man, trail mix crunch. Love it. Bacon, maple syrup, walnuts, cocoa. Chocolate orange machata. Whoa. Nice. Very good. Okay, we're still going. We got 20 seconds still. Onion, yes. Maple syrup, peanut butter again. Okay. Some good ones. 18 seconds. Everything pickle. Love it. Sweet potato, licorice. Yes. We are almost there. 2 seconds, 1 second, 0. Okay. I count salad with tomato. Incredible. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. 23 in 1 minute. Oh, I got a late one. Chocolate, peppermint, marshmallow. All right. Okay, what you just did there was you all ideated. This is my theory and my belief is that maybe some of you came in here thinking you're not artists, you're not creative, but this tells me that that's all a lie. Ideas are not hard to come by, right? But often what happens is we're going to filter, right? So I'm not picking on anyone, but like for instance, when someone says, "Oh, I got an idea, salad with tomato," have you ever like come up with an idea and you're like, "Oh, I don't want to say salad with tomato. That's crazy. Like, how would you make salad with tomato? And what would it taste like? That's so crazy." And you start filtering, and the whole time that idea hasn't come out. Whereas, like, think about um, someone who said like maple syrup peanut butter that was said before, or double bacon, you might have been thinking like, is this viable? Can we afford it? I don't know. And that's not the point of this. The point of this is just get it out there. Be playful. Don't judge it. Just let it out. So I don't know if some of you are musicians, but I'm a musician. And a lot of the keys to writing songs or writing an authors is like, you just got to get that first draft. Just throw everything out there, right? Your lyrics are so bad. You're not supposed to edit at this point. You just get whatever's out there. And then later on, you're going to be like editing and then kind of refining. But the key is to get out as many as possible. And that's really hard to do if you're all by yourself. So that's why you have a team to do this. So here's what we're going to do as a group. We are going to try and ideate together. So I want you to be thinking about your project challenge. And here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I want you to go for quantity over quality. Okay. I appreciate the playfulness and the openness of everyone. That's what we want. We're making up to these ideas. Okay. Now, I'm also going to give you constraints, just like how I gave you that 1 minute timer. It kind of like pushed people, right? Some people are like, oh man, I never would have made that idea unless I was kind of pushed to it. We're going to give you some time restraints for this. Now, the restraint I'm giving you is pretty short, shorter than it should be. But we encourage everything. I do want you to have good ideas, right? I don't want you to just be preposterous, but I want you to have the whole range of the brilliant and the ridiculous. Because sometimes when you have a ridiculous idea, it actually helps highlight a really good idea. So that idea in itself may not be very good, but it helps draw attention to the really good one. And so this is what I believe it was Jane who asked me, if I'm not mistaken, like, how you like have all these ideas and like how do you kind of bring it together? This ideation thing that I'm talking about right now is called diverging. We're going to diverge as long as we can, right? We're going to exercise those creative muscles. Because here's the thing, usually like your first batch of ideas are the really obvious ones and they're not bad. But it's once you get to that outer edge where you're really flexing and pushing your creative muscles, that's where the really interesting things start forming. Because all the obvious solutions are being occupied. So that's when you push to the outer edge and you might actually find something that you never thought of before. And that's why we do this exercise. Because near the end, there are some really interesting solutions I'd not heard of. And but that's kind of like accessing a part of the brain that we don't normally do right away. We always kind of go to the easiest spot first. And the other thing I really want to mention is, again, needs to be a team sport, right? We're not here. It's important to have diverse perspectives. So you don't want to be like laughing at or like making fun of other people's ideas. You want to be encouraging it. You want to have an environment where, like, yeah, whatever people say, like, we're going to consider it. We're open. Now, there is going to be a time where you're going to take all those divergent ideas and you're going to converge, right? And that's what we're going to get into next. So I want you to make something. Think about your project challenge. You now are informed by your insights. And now we're going to try and make a project that works this out. Okay, so I'm going to just make up just an example here. So from our observations, we made the insight. So my project challenge is I'm going to try and use how can we get people, how might we get more engagement in ministry, right? How might we gain more volunteers for ministry? Yeah, that was our project challenge. Um, what we observed is that people are very busy and they want to do something that's very meaningful for them and that is empowering for them. I don't know, something like that. So then what kind of idea can we do? What kind of mechanism or campaign can we do to get people involved in ministry, aware of these insights? How can we kind of fulfill that project challenge, aware of what we know about these insights? So we're going to throw a bunch of ideas against the wall. Like, what are ideas about like helping people know like they can track how much time is involved, their time commitment? How can they feel like this is meaningful? Like, how will they know that this is meaningful? How will they know that they really care about this? These are ideas we want to come up with. So I hope that makes sense. So that's just a little rough idea. But as you're making up ideas, Here's some key goals, some key things to keep in mind. I want you to defer judgment. Um, don't judge this idea as good or bad at this stage. You just want to be like, whatever goes. Encourage wild ideas. Yeah, let's try it. It might not happen, but this is not the time to like say if it's working or not. Just encourage the wild. Another thing is great is if someone comes up with an idea, don't try and compete and keep making like brand new ideas. Like you might see something and then build on top of it. That can be really fun. So someone just says something neat and you're like, oh, okay. So I always make fun of this idea is like first thing that people say, like, hey, let's do something really creative and new and innovative. Like, let's make a coffee shop, right? Okay, all right. So let's build on that. Like, what kind of coffee shop? Like, what would it do? Like kind of build on it and build more. And stay focused. Sometimes when we get really wild and we're diverging all over the place, we might just get really out of touch. Make sure your project challenge is the anchor that brings you back in. Okay. Um, the other thing is, try and have one conversation at a time. Don't let like one person dominate. There's some personalities that love talking and doing this stuff. Make space for each other to contribute. So when you go to your Google Slides, you can all write stuff in these blank slides, and you can make more slides, of course, if you don't have space. Make more slides. But as you're just going around sharing like ideas, try and listen to each other where people are going in. Sometimes it's hard to just like write down. Like it's actually really effective if you're brainstorming and if you feel comfortable. Like you could go on Google and like cut and paste different images. Don't worry about copyrights. We're all friends here. You could just like smash two things together, right? Um, like if you had an idea for a ministry and you had an idea like, oh, well, if it was like it looked like this, and we had this like project and we moved them together. It's really fun to see like visually if you can kind of smash stuff up. It might generate something. When you're converging, I'm sorry, when you're diverging, you want to go for quantity. You don't want to just like keep like tinkering with one idea. Like make one, make another idea, keep going. Don't self-edit. Don't second guess yourself. Like, oh, that was a dumb idea. That'll never work. Like, what about the finances and the budget? This is not the place to think about limitations. Think about like in an ideal situation where like money was not an object, like you didn't have to worry about church politics. Wow, we can only dream, right? But anyways, if that could happen, think of ideas. Don't self-edit, don't second guess. And then after you do that, we're going to have like a converge session. So we're going to have a diverge session and we're going to have a converge session, right? And at this session, you're going to look at all of your ideas and begin to focus on something that stands out to your team. Okay. Don't focus on the ideas that are easiest to do. In the second part of the stage, you're going to actually now try and dial in and identify of all this like range of ideas that you came up with, what are the best ones? So here's what we're going to do. In your group, everyone is going to have 3 votes to put next to your favorite idea. Okay. And so when you look at this whole range, so you got to come up with a lot of ideas. All right. So at the end of the day, your team is going to look at what are the 3 best ideas that we have, put your vote there, and you're going to try and identify them. The other exercise you're going to do is you're going to cluster your ideas together. Did you notice that when you're making ideas that some of them kind of sounded similar or they were same category? You want to try and like group them. You might copy and paste them, move them around, organize them however you like. And then you're also going to want to, now looking at these clusters and the votes, you're going to discuss like, oh, that's interesting. Look at this cluster. I never thought this would be a cluster that we came to. It could also be like, we came up with a lot of ideas like this. I don't feel comfortable about that. Actually, I really like this. I never thought we'd think up something like this. Could you imagine? Blah, blah, blah. Discuss, talk about it. Which ideas does the team like as a whole? What are the ones that you really feel like maybe there's something there that I would like to look into developing, right? And then at the end, you're going to choose the idea that you want to develop, right? Obviously, these were just made in the spur of the moment, but some of these ideas are really worth looking into and maybe like having further conversations and developing. Okay, so here's our group task. If you are up to the challenge, we are going to do part 1 where we're going to ideate, right? We're going to do the divergence, right? In 20 minutes, you're going to make as many ideas as possible in relation to your project to explore your insight. Okay. So you're going to need a timekeeper, someone who can just like set their phone or watch or whatever. 20 minutes. You're just going to start writing down, contributing as many ideas as possible. And then in 10 minutes, after that, you're going to organize your ideas, and then you're going to go through a system of choosing what do you think was the best idea. You can maybe choose two if you really have a hard time, but try and choose one or two. Okay. So, and you can have discussion about it, some friendly, kind debate, right? You don't want to be just attacking people, like saying that's stupid. That's not a good critique. But you can make a case for like why you're gravitating towards this rather than this. But we're just going to be doing that. So we're going to go 20 minutes, diverge, ideate as much as you want. And then after that, we're going to converge in 10 minutes. Okay. All right, we're going to be talking about iterating forward now. And what does that mean, iterating forward? What we're going to do today is we're going to make a prototype for our ministry project. Now, that sounds fancy, so don't be scared by this fancy language, but prototype is basically we're going to make something to get tangible with our idea. I heard some really cool ideas. I read some really fun ones in your previous group task. Now you're going to do is you're going to take that idea that you agreed on, and now we're going to make an actual working project of it. It's going to go from an idea to actually making it concrete. Now, here's something I want to share with you. Why do we prototype? We build something in order to think about it, right? It's about seeing and interacting with your ideas. That's the way things really get done, because when you do that, you see the kinks and you see ways to make it get better. And then you can find solutions faster if you build it. When you have something that is tangible and real, then it's much easier to get feedback from it from your community. There have been like ideas that I talked about, and people like panned it and they said all kinds of things. They gave me all kinds of feedback when it was just an idea. But when they saw it in person, their attitude was completely different. And the feedback, when they actually see what you're talking about, is much more effective than getting the feedback when it's just an idea, right? Now, one of the greatest things I think about prototyping, about making an actual thing first, is that it gives you the gift to fail early so that you can succeed sooner, right? Getting tangible and asking for early feedback allows you to make inexpensive mistakes rather than finding out something isn't working too far down the road. I don't know if some of you have done this in the past. Definitely I have, where I've gone all in on something and we went really far ahead. When if we had just like said like, hey, we're just going to start off with like a small version of it, get feedback, go back. But we went all in. And so when we finally did realize this isn't working, we really had to do some very painful backtracking to figure out where can we adjust. A lot of times we want to wait. And so I don't know if this is your background, but I was ministering in SoCal for a while, and I've been in ministry twice. And when I was studying theological education, there was a kind of a train of thought about like church growth models, where they talk about, if you're truly a healthy church, this is what you look like, this is what your metrics should be like, and they gave you all this kind of information. It sounded very compelling, but sometimes there was this idea of like you have to have a 5-year model. I don't know if some of you heard about this. Like you got to have a 5-year plan, and by the end of the 5 years, like you should arrive here. And those are helpful in some ways, but if we get too like uh, consumed by that, sometimes what can happen is like, well, what if you find out in year one that you've made a major mistake? Like, do you have a strategy to like just let go of your 5-year plan and then adjust and make it better? So what actually happens in organizations now is that they have something like, I don't know if you've heard of this, like it's called like a lean startup, where you start up something, you don't start up this like fully realized idea. You just start off with something very modest that is very lean. And why it's lean is that if something comes up with your first kind of version of it, you can adjust it very quickly and simply, and then you make your next version of it. So if some of you are kind of into software and technology, you heard about like, how your phones have the update. They have like a 1.0 update. That's the very lean beginning of it. Then they'll have a 1.1 where they really tweak it. Maybe the next tweak is a little more significant. So it's like a 1.3. And then they make something very significant. And then it goes up from 1.0 to 2.0. So that's how software works. And I wonder if, like, what if churches were like that? It's like, we just start off with a 1.0, no pressure, just tweak it 1.1. And then when we're ready, we'll jump to 2.0. But you can't make all of these interactions if you don't gather the feedback and the information, and you also keep putting it off. People keep thinking like we want to start from 3.0. They fully realize it's like, no, no, we all start at 1.0. 1.0 is just the beginning. There's even a phrase even before 1.0. It'd be like a 0 point something. They call those beta. Like that's even before you start, like just some working model. And that's what I want you to think about today. Let's make a working model. So I'm going to give you 15 minutes to create a prototype from your best idea. You're going to choose your favorite idea from what you did before. And in 15 minutes, you're going to try and just create some kind of action idea. Okay. So you want this idea to be formed enough that you could actually share it with your congregation. Okay. So like it could be like, oh, we want to do this thing, but like if it's just like one bullet point, that's not enough to be sharing to a group. You want to have some meat on the bones. You want to have something that has some substance to it. um, Now, how you can do this, I encourage you to, like, you don't have to be a trained artist. Maybe some of you, like someone in the room could just draw something, and then you could just take a phone picture of it and just like scan it into your Google slide, or just like cut and paste it into your Google slide if you want, or maybe you just like cut and paste from the internet. You could use stick figures, anything. It's fine. People in the room, it's not about how good an artist you are, but it's just like trying to realize, like, what does this look like? So you had an outreach into the city. Could you draw what it looks like? Just, through stick figures. Like, what would it look like, how people come in? And all of this stuff, why it's doing it is like it's challenging you to take it from an abstract idea and make it real. A lot of times when we're in these like vision meetings, it's all just so uh, in the ether, right? We want to kind of bring it back to earth. And if you can't articulate what your idea is, how on earth are you going to get your congregation to buy into it, right? So we want something that is tangible. Okay, so you're going to take 15 minutes to do this, to come up with an idea. And it's an idea that is shareable. So if you could, when we all come back together, can you share that with me in like a minute, what you are hoping to do? So here's what we want to do is that we want to build something. We want to get tangible quickly, right? We don't need you to sell your idea, right? Don't try and defend it. Don't be insecure about it. Just start somewhere, right? And then when you build it, you're going to reflect on what others have to say about it, right? Think about how you might respond to it. Okay, so that's what we're going to be trying to do here in this process. So I'm going to give you 15 minutes to do that. So what I was saying earlier is that we want to build, share, and reflect. You've all given some really great examples, doing great work. So where do we go from here? So after you've shared the idea, you want to actually just do it. And then as you do it, you want to reflect upon the feedback that you get from it, to listen carefully to people. Something I just want to share about the sharing part of it is that um, there's a phrase, with creatives, we talk about like, you've got to like kill your darlings. I really don't like that phrase at all. So I like to say like, just let go of your darlings. What I mean by that is that I don't know if you had a ministry idea where you got so fixated on a particular idea, and there's a very particular part of it that you just don't want to let it go because you just think it sounds so good. But all the feedback coming back to you is just really fighting back against it. There's something in me always that I just want to like dig in and like, I'm not letting go of that piece of the idea because I think that's the best piece. But if you are willing to just really listen to people, maybe that's the piece that needs to go to make things work. I remember very distinctly, I was at a church council meeting and I was talking, I actually had preformed all what they were going to respond. And everything about the presentation. And then halfway through, as I was listening to everybody, I realized, you know what? I need to be listening to the people, and what I was thinking is out of touch with them. So I had to let go of my darlings. And it was hard. In the
Mm.
moment, I felt very humbled and like my ego was kind of hurt inside, but it moved things along so well. And so it's really important as we're sharing, we're not here to defend it. We're here to just present it and then listen and reflect upon what's coming back. And so that process that I'm talking about is what we call iterating forward. Iterating is like repeating forward, right? After you build this prototype and you share about it, you want to reflect about what's coming back to you, right? So, what did you learn? What should we adjust? What should we do going forward? Um, so, an example of like how I did this in one church is that this church, I don't know, I was like stuck. Like they're not into outreach at all. And so I kept trying to push them into outreach and I was getting discouraged at um how very unenthusiastic they were about outreach. And so I just realized like I've got to stop just pushing it from my perspective, like trying to use biblical truths and all this. And I just kind of pulled back and I said, what do they love? And this was a church in San Francisco, and they love food. And so I said, you know what? I'm going to start with food. You folks love food. What can we do with food? And then we talked about let's do like a community dinner. Like we invite people, everyone brings like their favorite like dishes. And because they were all so gifted at cooking, and I don't know anything about food. And I was like, okay, this is not my comfort zone, but this is what you care about. And I learned to just work with it, right? I learned that my previous attempt to outreach was because I wasn't in touch, I wasn't observing properly. So then I returned, I just kind of came back to it, try it again, and I adjusted. Let's do something where you're the center of it, where we're using your gifts and your passions. And then we did it, and it was a great success. But even as we did it, I realized like, oh, that was a really good event, but how could we actually improve it and learn from what the people were experiencing? And so we did another version of it the next year, right? And so we're asking like, what did we learn? What should we adjust? What should we do going forward? So it was that continual process of upgrades that I was mentioning, right? It was like a version 1.0, 1.1, 1.2. And then in a coming year, a couple of years later, we did like a major change of like the approach to it. And that was like a 2.0. But it was really drawing from that original meeting that we started. And even before, from the failed like attempts at outreach that I'd done before. And so it's this continual process of upgrading. And I don't want to use upgrading as like the past was bad. It's just like you're learning and you're adjusting. Um, I am a young parent, and often I am just learning and adjusting as my child continues to grow. I'm just like, okay, well, I've learned this new insight. How do I adjust and respond to the moment? That's what pastoring is about. There's all these uncontrollable elements that we just encounter all the time. How do we respond to it? How do we adjust going forward? That's iterating forward. It's about learning through trial and error, right? You have to ideate and prototype repeatedly before you move forward. So it's not about just one prototype, it's about like a succession of prototypes over and over again. It's about sharing and receiving feedback. And when you get this cycle of iterating, these two things will help you improve your idea and get closer to where it needs to be. So maybe Chico First Baptist, he came up with an awesome idea in this room that you're meeting in right now. But then you took it out and you just brought it out to like an outer circle in your church, just a couple of other folks in the congregation. And then you got all this like feedback. And some of it was not in alignment with what you came up with in that original room. That's okay. You just begin to adjust and incorporate that. And how can you move it forward? It's a way of thinking of it as like you want to experiment your way forward, right? Think of yourself as an experimenter. If you don't first succeed, you should probably keep at it because failure is 100% necessary. If you folks have the time, I have an extra presentation that I'm not sharing at this group, but I'll be sharing um, at the group in the in-person retreat about the theology of failure and
Mm.
how
Wow.
Western societies, especially, we just really look down upon failure as like a shameful thing. But failure is so necessary for us to grow and to change. And if we're a Christian and we take seriously the theology of the cross is this embodiment of what it looks like when things don't go as we expect. But God works redemptively and resurrects us from our failures. So if there's any kind of group that should be really into failing and dying and messing up, it's got to be Christians. Because at the center of our faith is a cross. But how
Excellent.
many churches really lean into that, right? We're like, no, no, we've got to be perfect. We've got to avoid death at all costs. We've got to avoid um, dwindling congregation. We've got to avoid weakness at all costs. But what if we were really serious about this theology of the cross? We would be all about this idea of like iterating forward through failure, learning through failure, redeeming failure. And let's be practical. If you fail often and early, you save time in the long run. Making Many people make the mistake of racing forward once an early idea gains traction, but iteration actually saves you time in the long run. When you iterate, you manage this by repeatedly checking your assumptions and answering more refined questions. So if I got super excited by an idea that we generated today, and then I just like launched it, I made like a campaign for it and did all sorts of stuff, but I was not constantly checking in through these little iterations going forward, I might be so far ahead of my congregation, so out of touch with what the Holy Spirit is doing. I might have no choice but just to stop everything and backtrack until I can get back to where the people are at. So I really recommend that you do these like little steps forward because it's easy to take little steps back. But if you're really impatient and you want to do one giant leap for your church, you might need to do one giant leap backwards to undo something. Making a lot of these incremental steps is a lot more profound and it really engages the whole congregation so that everyone is much more involved. So this is something I want to get back to. Kathy was talking about earlier. It's like, well, how do we refine for the future? If you look at this a very important chart about desirability, feasibility, and viability, you want to be looking at where we start. We start with something like the idea we had, is it desirable? And then we want to talk about feasibility and viability. And that is where like some jargon comes in. So let me explain this a bit. Uh, Desirability is referred to like in design thinking as human centered because it's about people. Ministry is about God and people foremost. What are the needs, values, and desires of who we serve? So when I talk about desirability, I'm not talking about like creating like a desirable, like trendy church. I'm talking about like, is this a church? Are you doing something that really thinks about people? Like, is this what people really desire? So an example is, what if I made you a computer that is super advanced? It has the latest and greatest technology, but no one can use it, right? No one's going to use this computer because in the end, a computer is made for people to use as a tool. So if it's not helpful, then why are we going to do it? With churches, we have so many programs that we don't really think like, is this actually something that people need, that they want, that this is on their heart? Are we creating programs that actually that God is asking of us? In fact, we read in Scripture, God says, like, I don't accept some of your sacrifices because I never asked for this sacrifice. Right? Your sacrifices are detestable to me. But we got so far ahead of ourselves, we're thinking like, this is what you want, right, God? But we don't actually ask, like, God, what is it you desire? So is it desirable? The second thing that's important is feasibility. And this is kind of going back to what Kathy was talking about, like, how possible is this, right? What would it need to be a reality, right? This is where, like, you get those people in your leadership team who are the straight shooters, right? You've got the dreamers in there; they love coming up with dreams and ideas, and then you've got to get someone in there who's got to do that tough task of saying like, "Hey, how feasible is this, right? Like, how possible is this to do in a post-pandemic world, right? How feasible is this given the age of our congregation, the realities of our building, right? How feasible is this given where people are emotionally and spiritually right now? We can have some great dreams of like, oh, we want to outreach here and there, but Are you like really in touch with where your church is at? And this is where it's really important, again, to have good observations because your feasibility, the level of your feasibility, like how effectively you can judge feasibility, really depends on how well you observe your church. A common example is I see some churches are planning some projects and they've forgotten that they're only like a small church. You've created a program that is not suited to actually who you are. And that's not bad. Like if you're small, that's fine. It's just you're going to do things differently. And then there's these big churches who do things like they're a small church, and it's about figuring out who you are and being honest about it. What is feasible? And the third thing is viability. What this means is like, how sustainable is it? I have tons of ideas that come to me, and I think like, can you folks sustain that? Um, I know you can do one big event like that and feel really good about yourselves, but I don't want to do something that's a one-off. I would like to do something that has sustainability to it. How viable is it? Do we have resources that could continue to replenish this and make this work? So this is kind of like asking tough questions for folks about what would we need to do to make this something that can have a life, not just like just a little blip of existence, but an actual journey. So here's some things. If I could just sum up like some closing thoughts for all of you to think about, it's this. First thing, this is the most important. I would say if there's anything that you can take away from this, if you're a church in crisis, if you're in a church where you feel like you have no clue what you're doing, you're in a world that's unfamiliar, don't forget this very important part. Be hopeful. Um, I'm not saying be naive, don't be simplistic, be hopeful. You just got to understand that if we have the one that we identify as God, as the creator of all things, and if the creator of all things is with you, then there's still reason for hope. If you have a creator God who is also present even beyond death, that even through death of things, God can still find life, then we can be very hopeful. I think one of the hardest things that sabotages a lot of churches when we're doing these kind of innovation kind of like talks is like they think like I'm not innovative enough, we don't have what it takes. And you just got to stop for a second, pull back and remember you are with the God of life, right? You have reason to be hopeful. So wherever your church is at, whatever the journey, even if it means like God is leading you towards like closing a church, still be hopeful because our failures, our mistakes, our wrong turns are never the end of the story. The end of the story is always the God of life. And that is a message for all of us, definitely myself. Second thing I want to say for you is to learn from what you observe. I think one of the hardest things for me as a pastor is like when I get really negative, when I'm struggling, I get really self-critical. I don't know if you struggle with that. But what I need to do better is that I need to learn from what I'm observing, not to judge it. Um, your churches are all beautiful and wonderful. There are times where you get frustrated. You feel like, I love this church, but they drive me crazy. I've definitely felt that a lot of times. But maybe just take a moment to pause from that sort of narrative and that mindset and just pull back and say, what can I learn here? What am I seeing here? What is happening here? Where is God in this? Asking those questions doesn't necessarily change your circumstance, but definitely changes your approach to the circumstance. So I encourage you to be brave to ask those kind of questions. Learn from what you observe. The third thing is, as you probably noticed, like we spent a lot of time today, like 6 hours. This is a long time, but this is a journey. What I just described to you could take like years, possibly. It could take months. I don't know what it is for you. But if it's a journey, act like it's a journey, like prepare for the long haul. Um, a lot of times when I meet people who want to do like vision work or like changing or innovating, they just want it quick. And I'm like, I don't think it works that way. I just don't see it that way at all. This is a journey. And this is kind of tied to what I said earlier, is that there are no final failures in this journey. They're just opportunities for changes. no matter what you're going through, don't ever feel like any decision you make, anything that you plan today is going to end to the ultimate final failure, right? There's nothing that you could have done or decided on today in this meeting where God is going to say to you, okay, that does it. You're done. You're done. You're out of here. Right? Anything that you face, no matter how difficult it is, how how painful it is, how impacting or lasting it may be, in the end, they are just opportunities for change. Now, the change might be pleasant, difficult, joyous, I don't know, but they're just opportunities for changes. If we could kind of communicate that spirit and that culture to our churches, we would stop operating out of scarcity, out of anxiety, out of fear. You know, there's nothing that we can do as a single church that can derail who God is and God's goodness. Now, I think some of us think our church is very powerful and a big deal, but nothing is bigger than God. So rather than trying to challenge God, why don't we rest in that good news? Is that nothing is irredeemable. There's no wasted time. There's no wasted space for God. These are just opportunities for us to respond in the moment. Which leads to my very last thing that I want to say. Yes, the final point, how exciting, is you're not alone. Everyone in this conference, in the Evergreen family, this is one of the best things about, in my humble opinion, about the Evergreen Association of ABC, of American Baptist Churches, is that we really want you to be a family here and we don't want you to feel alone. Now, there might have been times where maybe Evergreen let you down. We weren't that family, but this is what we aspire to be. And so if you feel like you're stuck, if you feel like you don't know what to do, like you don't have all the answers, that's fine because you don't have to have all the answers. But you know what we can do is we can let you know you're not alone and that maybe people can come alongside you because there's a lot of folks who are thinking the same things as you, struggling with what you're struggling with, and actually also doing wonderful things too. And so you are not alone. You are not alone. And so honestly, if you can't remember anything today, I would love for you to just remember to be hopeful and to know that you're not alone. Because if you don't have those two things, there's no way you're going to innovate anything. But if you're hopeful and you know that you're not alone, you will be brave and you'll trust the lead of God. And so that's my heart for you. So I just want to end this time with this kind of prayer and this benediction. Um, I pray for all of you that you be filled with the creativity of the Creator, that you be filled with the grace of the Savior, and you be filled with the presence of our helper for all of you. Amen.